coffee had gone cold again. I didn't notice until I lifted the mug to my lips and felt nothing warm on the other side. That's how distracted I'd been, sitting at my kitchen table in Georgia, a legal pad in front of me, a pen behind my ear, trying to remember if I'd already confirmed the rehearsal dinner reservation or just thought about confirming it. I'm 71 years old. My name is Frances, and for the better part of 8 months, I had turned my retirement into a second job, planning my son's wedding. Not because he asked me to, because I offered. Because that's what I do. Because when you love someone, you show up with your whole self and your whole checkbook and apparently your whole sanity. My husband Gene passed 6 years ago this November, pancreatic cancer. Fast and cruel, the way that particular disease tends to be. We've been married 43 years, and when he left, he took with him the version of me that knew how to be still. I kept moving. I kept doing. It was the only way I knew to stay above water. So when my son, I'll call him my son because that's what he is, the boy I raised, when he called me on a Tuesday afternoon to say he was going to propose to his girlfriend Serena, I cried happy tears right there in my kitchen. I pressed the phone to my chest like a teenager. I said a little prayer. I thought, here's something good. Here's something to pour yourself into. And I poured. Serena came for money. That's not a judgment, just a fact. Her parents lived in a big colonial in Buckhead, drove matching SUVs, took a family trip to Europe every other summer. They were perfectly pleasant to my face. Her mother, Donna, had this way of smiling at me that never quite reached her eyes. The kind of smile that says, I see you and I've already decided what you are. My son had met Serena at work. They dated for 2 years. She was sharp, organized, and particular about things. She had strong opinions about centerpieces. I know this because I sat across from her to brunch the previous spring while she explained, for 20 minutes, why garden roses were superior to peonies in every measurable way. I nodded and drank my mimosa and thought, she makes my boy happy, so she makes me happy. That was the deal I made with myself, and I kept to it, right up until I didn't. The engagement party happened at Donna's house, which was fine, which was expected even. The bride's family hosts the engagement party. I knew that. I brought a card, a bottle of good Bordeaux, and a smile. The whole evening, I sat at a round table near the back with my son's college friends and their wives, while Serena's family worked the room like they'd rehearsed it. My son floated between both worlds, the way he always has, trying to make everyone comfortable. Bless his heart. On the drive home that night, I told myself, don't keep score. Don't be that mother-in-law. 3 weeks later, my son came to visit me on a Sunday. Just him. Serena had a bridal event with her friends. He sat down at this very kitchen table and said, Mama, I want to ask you something, and I want you to feel free to say no. He looked so earnest, so much like Gene when Gene was young. The venue we picked, he said. It requires a 50% deposit to hold the date. It's the Magnolia House. You know the one out on Crest Road? I knew it. Everyone in town knew it. Old estate property converted into an event space. Beautiful. Expensive. We've put down what we can, he said, but we're a little short. We were hoping, if it's okay, if you're comfortable, maybe you could help cover the rest of the deposit, and we'd pay you back before the wedding once we get our tax refund. The amount he said was $4,200. I wrote the check that afternoon. I didn't hesitate. I didn't ask for anything in writing, because this was my son, because this was his wedding, because Gene wasn't here to walk him down any aisle, and I was going to make sure what I could give, I gave fully. Thank you, Mama, he said, folding the check carefully like it was fragile. That was October. By January, the wedding planning had taken on a life of its own, and most of that life happened without me. Serena had a binder. She'd been working on it since before the proposal, apparently. Florists, photographers, caterers, a calligrapher for the invitations, all of it color-coded and tabbed. I found this out not because she told me, but because my son mentioned it casually over the phone one evening. "Oh, Serena's already got most of it locked down," he said. "She's really on top of it." I said, "That's wonderful." I meant it. What I didn't expect was to mean it quite so literally. That she was on top of it, and I was underneath it, somewhere, not visible from where she was standing. The invitations went out in February. I found out from my neighbor Phyllis, who called to tell me she'd received hers. She was on the guest list. I was on the guest list, obviously, but what I did not know, what I had not been told, was that the seating for the ceremony had been arranged, and I was not in the front row. I was in the third row. Serena's parents and grandparents were in the first row, on the bride's side. The second row, on the groom's side, had been reserved for my son's college friends. The third row was where I'd been placed. I found this out because my cousin Evelyn, who lives 2 hours away and had offered to drive down with her husband, called me to ask which row we'd be sitting in so she could gauge how early they needed to arrive. She'd called my son's cell to ask. He'd told her. Then Evelyn called me. I sat with that information for 2 full days before I said anything. I called my son on a Wednesday evening after dinner. I kept my voice even. I asked him simply if he could explain the seating arrangement to me. There was a pause that lasted too long. "It's not a big deal, Mama," he said finally. "It's just how Serena organized it. She wanted her immediate family front and center on both sides." "Her immediate family is in row 1, I said, "and row 2 on your side is your college friends. Mama, Jean's sister flew in from Oregon for your uncle's funeral and sat in the front row of that church," I said. "I'm just trying to understand." Another pause. Serena felt it would look more balanced, visually, in the photos. I didn't say what I wanted to say. I thanked him and told him I loved him and said goodnight. Then I sat in the dark in my living room for a long time, thinking about Jean, thinking about how he would have handled this. Jean was never loud, but he had a way of making things clear without raising his voice. He used to say, "Francis, you can love someone and still require them to treat you right. The two aren't mutually exclusive." I thought about the check. I thought about $4,200. I thought about how I hadn't received a single receipt from the venue, not even an email confirming the deposit had been applied. The next morning, I called the Magnolia House. "I want to tell you something. I almost didn't. I almost talked myself out of it. I told myself I was being petty. I told myself this is his day, not yours. Let it go." But something in me, some quiet, firm thing that sounds a lot like Jean, said you have every right to ask a simple question. I called and asked to speak with someone in reservations. A pleasant woman named, well, it doesn't matter what her name was. She pulled up the booking. She confirmed the date, the package, the deposit. "And can you confirm the name on the account?" I asked. She told me it was Serena's mother, Donna. The deposit, my $4,200, had been transferred to an account in Donna's name, and the reservation had been moved entirely under Donna's contact information. My name appeared nowhere. I was not listed as a contributor, a family contact, or anything else. I said, "Thank you so much," very calmly. I hung up the phone. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water and drank all of it standing at the sink. Then I sat back down and started making some calls of my own. My sister-in-law, Bertrice, Jean's younger sister, who's been in my corner since the day I married her brother, picked up on the second ring. "Talk to me," she said, "because Bertrice always knows. I told her everything." She didn't say a word until I finished. Then she said, "Francis, baby, what do you need me to do?" I told her what I was thinking. She said, "I'm with you, 100%. I also called my attorney. His name is Mr. Ellison, and I've used him for estate work since Jean passed. I explained the situation, that I had written a personal check for a wedding deposit, that the money had been applied to an account I had no access to or knowledge of, that my name had been removed from the reservation. He listened. He asked a few questions. Then he said, "Francis, I'd be happy to send a letter on your behalf." Very polite, very clear. That letter went out on a Thursday. My son called me that Friday night at 8:47 p.m. I know the time because I was watching the news and I noted it when my phone lit up. Mama, he said, and his voice was tight. What is this letter? It's a request, I said, for documentation of how my deposit was applied. You went to a lawyer? I went to my attorney, yes. The same one who helped me handle your father's estate. He sends letters. That's part of what he does. Mama, she's very upset. I understand, I said. I'd like the documentation, please, or the money returned. It's not that simple. The venue, my name isn't on the venue reservation, I said. So legally, I have no commitment to that venue. The money I gave was given in good faith, based on the understanding that it was going toward a booking that included my family. It was removed from that context without my knowledge or consent. Silence. I love you, I said. I want your wedding to be beautiful. I want you to be happy. But I need to be treated like I matter in this family. That's all I've ever asked. He said he needed to talk to Serena. I said, okay. And then I waited. While I waited, I did something that I want to tell you about. Because it matters. I called my friend Cecile. We've known each other 30-something years. We met in a Bible study group and stayed friends long after either of us was particularly faithful about attending. Cecile is 73, recently widowed herself, sharp as a tack, and funnier than anyone gives her credit for. I also called my neighbor Phyllis, who had been quietly furious on my behalf since she found out about the seating chart. And I called Bertrice, of course. The four of us had dinner at my house that Saturday night. Cecile brought a sweet potato pie. Bertrice brought wine. Phyllis brought a lasagna that could have fed a football team. We sat around this table for 4 hours. We talked and laughed and sometimes sat quietly together in that comfortable way you only can with people who've known you long enough to understand your silences. At some point, Cecile looked at me across the table and said, "You know what you need?" "What?" "You need something to look forward to. Something just for you?" I hadn't had that in a while. Since Jean, everything I'd looked forward to had been connected to someone else. My son's graduation, my son's promotion, my son's engagement. Everything was for somebody. Cecile said there's a women's retreat up in the North Georgia mountains. 3 nights, 4 days. Hiking, cooking classes, good conversation. My church group has a trip booked for April. There are 2 spots left. I looked at her. "Book it," Bertrice said. So I did, right there at the table on my phone, while Phyllis refilled everyone's wine. 2 spots, one for me and one for Cecile. The deposit was $150 each, and I paid it without a second's hesitation. 2 weeks passed. My son came to see me in person this time. He drove the 40 minutes from his apartment on the Tuesday afternoon, and he sat down across from me at the same kitchen table, and he looked like a man who had been having a very hard time. "Mama," he said, "I owe you an apology." I let him talk. He told me that when they'd finalized the booking, Serena had suggested moving everything under her mother's name because Donna had offered to help cover additional costs, and it simplified things. He said he hadn't understood at the time what that meant for my contribution. He said he should have asked. He said he should have kept me informed. He said the seating arrangement had been Serena's decision, and when he'd heard about it, he'd accepted it without pushing back, and he was sorry for that. I kept telling myself it wasn't a big deal, he said, but I wasn't asking myself whether it was a big deal to you. Jean used to say the apology that means something is the one that shows understanding, not just regret. This one showed understanding. I could tell the difference. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. "I forgive you," I said. "I love you. I'm not going anywhere." He exhaled like he'd been holding that breath for 2 weeks. "The venue coordinator," he said, "is willing to add your name back to the file as a primary depositor." Donna agreed. "And the seating." Serena agreed to move you to the first row. "I don't need the first row," I said. "I just needed to know I wasn't invisible." "You're not invisible, Mama," he said. "I'm sorry I made you feel that way. The wedding is still happening. In May, At the Magnolia House on Crest Road with garden roses because Serena was right about the garden roses. I don't know yet if Serena and I will ever be close. I hope we will. I think there's more space for that now than there was before. Sometimes people need a boundary drawn before they know where the line actually is. What I know for certain is that the April retreat was one of the best things I've done for myself in years. The mountains were just starting to green up. Cecile and I shared a cabin with two other women, strangers who became familiar by the end of the first evening. We hiked a trail that about killed me on the uphill and was pure mercy on the way down. We cooked a big pot of vegetable soup from scratch. We sat on a porch in the early morning with coffee that was actually hot, watching mist come off the ridge, and I didn't think about seating charts or deposits or apologies for a single second. I thought about Jean, but gently, the way I've learned to. I thought about how long I had spent making myself smaller in rooms where I deserved to take up space. On the last evening, we built a small fire outside the main lodge and everyone sat around it. The retreat leader asked us each to say one thing we were leaving behind and one thing we were taking home. Some women cried, some laughed. When it came to my turn, I thought for a moment. I'm leaving behind the idea that loving people means disappearing for them, I said, and I'm taking home the reminder that I'm still here, that I still matter, that 71 isn't the end of anything. Cecile, sitting beside me, squeezed my hand. The fire crackled. Somewhere down the ridge, something moved through the trees. A deer, probably, or just the wind. I stayed right where I was and let the warmth come to me. That was enough. That was more than enough. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot lately. Not in any grand philosophical way. Just the quiet, everyday version of it that you start to notice when you've lived long enough to see patterns repeat themselves. When I wrote that check for $4,200, I did it out of love. That's the truth. But somewhere underneath the love, if I'm being honest with myself, there was also something else. A habit I'd built over decades of making myself easy to overlook. I gave without asking questions. I trusted without asking for confirmation. I stepped back without anyone having to ask me to. And for a long time, I told myself that was generosity. Now I think some of it was just fear. Fear of being difficult. Fear of being the mother-in-law who causes problems. Fear of taking up too much space. What I've learned, slowly, the way you learn things that cost you something, is that when you consistently make yourself invisible, the people around you eventually stop looking for you. Not out of malice, necessarily, just out of habit. My son didn't put me in the third row because he wanted to hurt me. He did it because no one had ever required him to consider where I stood. That's on me, as much as it's on him. I had trained the people I loved to expect me to quietly accept whatever was handed to me, and they did. The moment I stopped accepting it, the moment I picked up the phone and asked a simple, factual question, everything shifted. Not dramatically, not with shouting or ultimatums. I just required an answer. And in requiring that answer, I required something larger, the acknowledgement that I existed in this story, that my contribution mattered, that my presence was not optional. That's the thing about self-respect. It doesn't announce itself. It just acts. It asks the question. It makes the call. It sits down with an attorney and says, here is what happened, here is what I need. It doesn't beg and it doesn't rage. It simply refuses to disappear. Bertrice understood that instinctively. Cecile understood it. The women I sat around that fire with in the North Georgia mountains understood it. There is a particular kind of wisdom that comes from having lived through enough to know what you will and will not carry anymore. I watched it in the faces of those women all weekend, the way they laughed freely, the way they said hard things simply, the way they had stopped apologizing for needing things. I want to be that. I am becoming that. What I know now at 71 is that how you allow people to treat you is a decision you make every single day, whether you realize it or not. It's not a dramatic declaration. It's 1,000 small moments where you either speak or go quiet, where you either ask the question or decide it's not worth the trouble. I spent too many years deciding it wasn't worth the trouble. The fire on that last evening, the mist on the ridge the following morning, the coffee that was still hot when I picked it up, those things were worth the trouble. I was worth the trouble. I still am.